Conversations over lunch, and please continue to eat. I'm Deborah Jacobs. I'm Director of Collection Services for the Perkins System Libraries here at Duke, and I'm thrilled to be welcoming you to this event, which is bringing together people from TRLN around the issue of open access, which it seems to be all around us. There's the ARL newsletter, there's the Library Journal. They're everywhere I've been looking this week, even without trying, I've been running across some articles on open access. So today we have two panelists physically with us, and one with us by telephone from Atlanta, where he's been stranded. Since you all have the sheet that's gone around, I'm not going to present lengthy remarks about the speakers because you can read that for yourselves. But I think we're going in this order. Jean-Claude Guedon is going first. And then Mark, will Mark come afterwards on the telephone, or will he be Peter? Okay, Peter Suber is right here. And so if you can work your way up to the front here.
Right.
Hi, nice to meet you.
Yeah,
so I will turn the floor over to Jean-Claude, and hope we have a very good discussion here today, and welcome to all of you. I have to switch places with you.
That's okay. Excuse me. Well, it's a pleasure to be here today, and as I have, I think, about 15 minutes, I'll be extraordinarily schematic because I can't really go into all the details. I suspect my part in today's little event is to try and recap very quickly how we got here in this kind of difficult situation we're finding ourselves in the general area of scientific communication. The basis of the whole scientific communication system, it must be remembered, is really an important sort of move that the scientists invented for themselves way back in the 17th century, when they tried to establish a way to collaborate with each other while maintaining a high level of competition, and while maintaining, of course, a clear and unassailable hold on what we might call nowadays intellectual property. What they really wanted then in the 17th century was really nothing more than having their names strongly, firmly, irrevocably attached to a certain text. Obviously, Newton wanted to be named when he came up with his laws, for example, and these are the kinds of difficulties they were trying to solve. The way to do it was clever. It was, in effect, to take a whole community of competitors as their witnesses for their work. In effect, by giving the stuff away to the competitors, they forced the competitors to say, yeah, indeed, it's Newton who really wrote this, because if I deny that it is Newton that did this, everybody else is going to say you're lying. So you had better go along with the crowd and try and do better than Newton, which is a bit difficult in that case, but you still try to do your best within that kind of game. And the whole thing became a little bit more formalized when people went from literally a mail system, people sending letters to each other, sort of very, very awkward form of internet, if you want, in the 17th century. There were some routers involved, but I won't go into that. People who had very strong hands to write a lot of letters. But the important part was really people designing eventually what became prototypes of modern scientific journals. And again, the economics of this kind of system, which was just formalizing the intellectual property game I just brought about, was fairly simple. Essentially, at the beginning, institutions that recognize each other as scientifically sound, mainly in the 18th and 19th century, the national or provincial academies, and then later on the learned societies that developed. In passing, universities got into that game very late into this game. They were just essentially doing the filtering, the peer review locally, and then they were bartering their journals with each other. And so that they were, let's say, footing the price of these journals, and then they were just bartering them, with the result that then with the cost of one journal, say with 300 or 400 copies, you could theoretically get get 300 or 400 journals by the simple bartering process I just adumbrated. This went on, and again, I'm just fast forwarding into the present. This went on until the 20th century, more or less in that fashion, with some commercial intrusion coming in the later second half of the 19th century. But everything continued in this way until the Second World War, when essentially after the war, something new happened. A very, very brusque acceleration in scientific research brought in a crisis in bibliographic tools. And in fact, some bibliographies really even fell behind rather badly. Some of you may remember, I've read about the problems of the American Chemical Society with chem abstracts in that period. This led to research, of course, and responses. And not that I'm trying to emulate Toynbee now, but you're getting the point. And the result of it, the most important result for us today, was of course Garfield's invention of the Science Citation Index. Now, all in itself, that invention was a rather remarkable form of innovation, I would say. Yet it rested on one interesting assumption, which was, and it was justified on statistical grounds, which was that in some fashion you could just take a small subset of the scientific journals of the world, trace the citations there, and thereby get a good picture of what was really important in science. But in so doing, without fully realizing it, I think, Garfield created or contributed to create something very, very different, which was a kind of notion, a mythical notion that became, in fact, now embedded in our vocabulary. We now refer to that as core journals, and we mention something like core science, which is like this synthetic collection of aggregated collection of these journals. There were about 1,000 of those at the beginning. Nowadays we're more up to about 8,000, if I'm not mistaken, with the whole web of science. Now, all this is still all right until you get into the situation where let's say, a shrewd businessman says to himself, as librarians are beginning to understand that these core journals could constitute a sort of basic reference for building a collection, when a shrewd businessman says to himself, if all libraries think they have to buy that, that's exactly what I want to own, because then I'm going to be able to deal with these libraries, not in terms of a market in the traditional sense, but in terms of what economists call an inelastic market. So that's essentially what Robert Maxwell did. And he bought journals which were already defined as core journals. He constructed new journals and propelled them by all sorts of means, inventing forms of scientific marketing, which in itself is a bit surprising, to pilot, to steer his journals into the core area of the Science Citation Index. And that's when something that in the library world is well known, that's when the serial pricing crisis began in earnest, and we're really by now around 1970, 1975. And from that point on, the whole idea of a system of science based on the more or less free exchange of validated peer-reviewed articles were in effect, I would say, deflected from its original aim to become a system where a core elite set of journals, which was supported by a strong financial barrier, became in effect the way to become really well known and well respected in science. From a competitive excellence seeking system, we had moved without even noticing it into an elitist, plutocratic kind of system, and that was not very good for science. I'll go very, very quickly now to the present, in which, because of all this situation, which was exacerbated actually by the digitization process and the move to the licensing schemes that you're probably very familiar with, which I could go into that as well, but which are not part of that process. They're really part of the digitization, transition. I would like to look more closely now at what were the reactions to that, and then I'll leave on Peter develop this whole point. What has been developing in the recent past has been the emergence of a series of attempts to try solutions for this kind of situation. And essentially, two solutions have emerged, one of which I think is not a good one I think is a very promising one. The not the good one has been purely defensive. It has been the consortium system of the libraries, and it actually responds more to the digitization situation and the economics of this kind of context, rather than the serial pricing crisis as it emerged even in print before digitization came on. The second one, which began recently, and which is much more promising, is of course the open access so-called movement. Now, what does the open access say? It says a number of things that should be very carefully distinguished from what you may have heard or what you may have been told. Open access doesn't mean non-peer reviewed. It means peer reviewed, or it accommodates peer review without any difficulty. Open access can involve an upfront payment system instead of a subscription payment system, but it's not the only business plan that is available for open access, and I'll let Peter develop that point because I think he knows it a lot better than I do. Open access doesn't necessarily rest purely on the let's say the assumption that all journals are going to transform themselves into open access journals. It may also rest on the creation, of course, an entirely new open access journals, and this is happening. The Public Library of Science is the most spectacular, probably the most spectacular example of that at present, but Biomed Central and a number of other fields are doing like that. Open access, in fact, goes even further. It doesn't even have to rest on the notion of journals. Open access could be a system of peer review built on top of things such as institutional repositories, which would allow libraries and scholars to get together and work together on the whole, I would say, reform of the whole system of communication of science that has been so badly, I would say, perverted, and I think I can go that far, by the recent evolution of scientific communication. Open access really means one very important and very simple objective. In effect, what we have since the 17th century is the remarkable invention of very, very good minds trying to, through a competitive system, trying to build the best forms of knowledge that can best help us all. The communication system that was designed to do that has been in effect made less, and really a lot less than optimal, by the recent evolution of the communication system. And what open access really tries to say is, let's get back to that original objective. Let's see how we can put the best scientific minds of the planet in full synergy to create the best competition between them so as to produce the best knowledge possible at the highest possible speed. And let's do it in such a way that at this level of fundamental knowledge, we're deeply into a non-competitive economic system, but really producing knowledge almost for its own sake as a foundation for the rest of human activities. Let's make sure that that form of knowledge is not just contained in a few countries and a few labs and locked up behind a few journals. Let's try and make it a system in which the whole of the planet can contribute to it and benefit from it. In other words, for example, let's not cut out 80% of the human minds from this scientific adventure that started in the 17th century, and let's try and redesign our communication system so as to bring about a great many more and better results for all of us. Open access is not a one solution to this big project. It's a way of exploring in a variety of directions, solutions that can bring about that very, very sort of objective. And from that point on, I'd like to let Peter continue and develop in his own way a similar theme. Thank you.
Thanks, Jean-Claude. If I could just get my, here we go. My task today was to talk about the current state of open access. And just before I got started, Melissa thought it might be helpful to say a couple more things about open access itself. And maybe the best transition to my talk about the current state is to pick up where Jean-Claude left off. I think the history of open access, this is the wrong, sorry. To pick up where he left off, because I think the history of journals is the best explanation for why open access works. In 1665, when the first journals were invented by scientists, they did not pay their authors. And the reason was probably that they didn't have any money to pay their authors. But that tradition of not paying authors has continued to this day, even though journals have found ways to make considerable revenue. The reason they could get away with not paying authors in the beginning is that they had other ways to reward authors who published in them. Particularly, authors got a chance to put a timestamp on their work and establish priority over other authors working on the same problem. This was the way Jean-Claude described the way they could compete while cooperating. That reward still exists with journals, and that's still why scholars write for impact and not for money. It's why they voluntarily, even eagerly, submit their work to journals that don't buy it, don't pay any royalties. And this fact makes the scholarly journal article almost unique in the landscape of intellectual property. In my view, it's the most significant kind of literature which is royalty-free but copyrightable. In the past couple of years, starting with the Budapest Open Access Initiative, there have been a series of important public endorsements of open access by different groups showing that scientists, librarians, funding agencies, and scholars themselves are getting behind the concept, are understanding what it is. I'd be happy to elaborate on those, but I'd really rather just point out that these are just statements of endorsement, and they don't provide open access. Most of them have plans for providing open access, and what I really want to talk about is the state of the implementation of those plans. How far along are we? But the point is that the concept has spread, and it has been accepted partly through these statements which attract their own publicity. One of the most important kinds of momentum is that agencies that fund research have seen that it's in their interest to provide open access to the results of that research. The theory is if they're going to invest money in a research project, it's because that project is useful. It has benefits for consumers or for patients or for humanity. And if it really has those benefits, then it ought to be shared so that people who can make use of it will be able to make use of it. The Bethesda conference, which is actually up here as well, in June of 2003, brought together some of the largest private funders of medical research and got them to agree that open access is in their interest. And what they agreed to do then was to pay the fees charged by open access journals. Let me just digress for a minute on how open access journals are funded. They don't have subscriptions. They don't have pay-per-view. That's the whole point. Readers get them free of charge. But they still have expenses. The typical way that an open access journal in medicine will pay those expenses is to charge either the author or the author's sponsor. And the author's sponsor is usually a funding agency, a government, or an employer. And at Bethesda, the major medical research funders said, we'll pay those fees. When our authors, when our grantees want to publish in open access journals and they have to pay fees to do so, they can come out of our grants. The Berlin Declaration on Open Access, which is last fall, brought together some public funding agencies, mostly from Europe, especially Germany and France, but also Holland, Italy, Norway, Hungary, and some others, and they agreed to do the same thing. We don't yet have too many public funders in the United States who are willing to do this, but the NIH, for example, the largest public funder by far of scientific research in this country, has agreed to do it. It's fairly inconspicuous about it. It doesn't advertise the fact that it's willing to pay these fees, but it is. This is important. This is not the same thing as telling the recipients of these grants that they must provide open access to their work, and I'll talk about that in a second. But it says if you want to publish your work in an open access journal, we'll pay the cost. It's a way of saying the cost of disseminating this work free of charge is a cost of research, and we're willing to pay that if that's the way you want to disseminate it. Another important part of the momentum nowadays is that What used to be blanket dismissal of open access and hostility to open access has turned into open-minded skepticism about open access. Many journals are willing to experiment with open access to provide data for themselves on whether it will work. Others are willing to monitor the experiments of others, provided others are willing to do the experiments first on their behalf. In other words, they're asking for data. And there are about a dozen research projects ongoing, including one by Mark McCabe, who might join us by telephone, to provide that data and or to analyze that data. The data is being provided by open access journals that are willing to share it with these analysts. And there's good evidence that we're going to get a large sample as opposed to a small sample, which is good. And there's good evidence that the results will be trusted by the skeptics, which is good. The skeptics are agreeing to look. They're agreeing that these analyses are independent. And there's also, of course, the promise that the results will be positive. There have been open access journals since 1987, which is before there was a World Wide Web. That is, they were open access on the pre-web internet. They were peer-reviewed as early as 1987. The ones that were launched in 1987 don't exist today. So there are questions about their economic sustainability. But there are 1,090 peer-reviewed open access journals as of this morning, listed by the Lund University Directory of Open Access Journals. So there's a lot of journals in every discipline around the world, and some track record for each one. So the results should show that in some circumstances, that is for some research niches, for some nations, maybe even for some decades, open access journals will be economically sustainable. The Wellcome Trust, the largest private funder of medical research in the UK, recently did a study of the economics of open access journals, and it concluded that they cost 30% less than traditional journals, and they can pay their bills. That was a good shot in the arm. That's this report right here for open access journals. The UK inquiry is another important piece of recent momentum. This was an inquiry conducted by the House of Commons Science and Technology Committee into the question whether the UK government should support open access or maybe even require open access to the results of government-funded research. They had 4 sessions of oral evidence during the past 3 months, and some were from publishers, some were from scholars, some were from librarians, some were pro-open access, some were against. It brought a lot of publicity to the concept, and I think it brought a lot of favorable publicity because, in my neutral opinion, many of the arguments against open access were transparently absurd, and they were put on the public record for the first time. We heard publishers say, for example, that a freely available online journal will be less accessible than a priced printed journal. We heard a publisher of a commercial journal say that it's harmful to the public to have access to scientific knowledge. There was recently a report by Thomson ISI on the impact, the citation impact of open access journals. And it answered an objection that had been raised by Elsevier ever since the concept had been floated, and that is that open access journals somehow corrupt peer review. Because they accept money for published articles, they have an interest in accepting weak articles. The Thomson ISI report showed that the quality, on average, is exactly the same. And that's measured by citation impact, the same measurement that Elsevier wants to use. By the way, it's not the measurement I want to use, but if we're going to play that game, at least we can show that we are not worse. And there is evidence that we're better, that is, that citation impact is better for open access articles. That evidence right now centers on one article by Steve Lawrence, but there's a couple new studies that are coming out. It's based on the fairly intuitive idea that open access journals have a much, much larger audience than any priced literature. Essentially every connected person in the world has access. And as soon as you enlarge the audience that much, you will also increase usage and therefore citations. There are different rules of thumb in different disciplines, but I just learned that the rule of thumb in astrophysics is that 17 downloads equals 1 citation. And for every 17 people who actually get as far as reading your article, one of them will cite it in print. So that shows that there's going to be a correlation between accessibility, downloads, and eventually citations. And so when somebody documents the correlation between open access and citation impact, I'm not surprised, even though Lawrence's data has been questioned, mainly because it's in computer science, and people wonder whether computer science will transfer to other disciplines. Data from other disciplines is forthcoming. You probably know that Yahoo, Google, primarily, but some other mainstream for-profit non-academic search engines are taking an interest in open access data. And the main reason is they haven't been indexing it up until now. If they do index it, they make their own indices larger. They will attract new users for this useful content, and then they can sell more advertising. So it's clearly in their interest. They're not incompatible with open access because they allow free searching. The fact that they profit from it through advertising doesn't get in the way of the openness of that access. There are open access archives, as Jean-Claude mentioned. These tend to be interoperable with one another because they all comply with the same protocol for metadata harvesting. And that protocol has kept these search engines out until now. That is, the Google crawler won't go into these archives, and the Yahoo crawler wouldn't go in. But there are now tools that let them in, and sometimes it's because the archives feed their metadata directly to the search engines, and some of that is happening now with Yahoo, and sometimes it's because Google is going out of its way to find a way to crawl these indices. In other words, they have seen that it's in their interest, and we will see these search engines start to index this data. Even though the stuff was already openly accessible, in that sense about as accessible as it could be more visible. That is, it has to be visible to the people who need it. And if the people who need it search in Google before they search in, let's say, Skiris, we want them to be able to find it in Google. We want them to be able to find it any which way. So the more different indices that include it, the better. Let me say something about these archives and repositories. There are about 530 that are compliant with this OAI metadata harvesting protocol today. Some of these are hosted by disciplines. Some of them are hosted by professional societies. Most of them are hosted by universities. That's the good news. The problem is filling them up. If you have an institutional repository, the idea should be that all the research articles produced by faculty at that university should be on deposit there. When it's first finished, a preprint should be on deposit. Later, when it's published, maybe even a revised version, the refereed version should be put in the archive as well. We had evidence a couple months ago that 55% of journal publishers consent to post-print archiving. Even the alternate edition that survived peer review through their editorial process could be put online free of charge in one of these archives. That's when we only measured by publisher. When we break it down by journal, it turns out that about 82 or 83% of journals already allow post-print archiving. So the permissions are not a problem. Even when authors transfer copyright to journals, 83% of the time they have automatic permission from a standing policy of the journal to put that in an open access repository. That doesn't mean it's going to get there. We're this close to a really good solution. The authors write electronic copy in the first place. 83% of publishers already consent to this. 530 institutions, more or less, have the repositories in place. And even when they don't, there's a disciplinary repository in almost every discipline where you could put your work even if there's not one at your university. So why aren't faculty making these deposits? That's a really hard question. I'd love to talk about it if I had another hour. One factor is that faculty don't know and don't care about the technology and economics of scholarly publishing. They care about their research projects. That's all they care about. In fact, they resent any effort to avert their gaze from their research project to something else, especially something they consider irrelevant and boring. The trick is to get them to see that this is relevant to their research. This is relevant to their career building. I used to work for a recording studio, and I hung a mic on a stage from a beam, and the beam was off-center. And I asked my boss, should we move the beam? I don't even know how to do that. Could we find out how to do it? And he said, no, don't worry about it. As soon as the actors see where the microphone is, they'll go over there. That's what we hope will happen. That as authors see that their careers can be built by making their works openly accessible, that their impact will build, that their visibility will build, that the people who need to see their research will see it, will build on it, will cite it, will apply it, then they'll go where the microphone is. They'll go to the open access outlets. But they don't see that yet. It's not like a microphone hanging in front of them that they can see. They don't see it. And so we have a lot of education to do. This article that I'm citing here from last month, Ariadne, shows the difficulty of getting faculty to fill a repository that already exists. This is one at the University of Glasgow. The OA journal infrastructure is also fairly strong and robust, considering that it's only been growing for a couple of years. There are 10,090 listed in that link directory. This is about 5% of all the peer-reviewed journals in all the disciplines, in all the languages around the world. But it's not 5% of the literature, because these journals tend to publish fewer articles. That's not bad news, by the way. I think that's good news. because it tends to rebut the objection that these journals have a financial interest in taking anything that comes through the door and in lowering their standard. The evidence is that they have a high peer review standard, and when their standard is not met, they publish a small issue. And in fact, it's very good news, because I think this argument about low quality can be turned against the traditional journals. They have a standard space to fill, regardless of the quality of their submissions. And if they don't fill that space, they have paying subscribers who will protest. Open access journals don't have paying subscribers, and they don't have the standard space to fill up. So when they have a temporary dearth of excellent submissions, they can publish a small issue and nobody will protest. When they do publish small issues, I think then we should recognize that that's the kind of logic at work. But the bad news is, this is a small percentage of the literature. Open access journals are not publishing a big percentage right now. Open access archiving provides more open access to more literature, but it's not clear how much more. It's still a minority literature, there's no doubt about it. On the journal side, here are some of the reasons for the delay. Launching new open access journals has several problems. First, you've got to get together an editorial board which is authoritative within that research niche, and that's sometimes easy to do, sometimes hard. Sometimes you need some initial investment. You always need some host, you need some infrastructure. And by the way, that could be a library. At a growing number of open access journals, the publisher is actually the library. Libraries don't have to do peer review, they just have to host the machine that disseminates the open access articles. But there's this vicious circle. To attract excellent submissions, you need prestige. And to have prestige, you need excellent submissions. And it's not just a joke, it's a real problem that faces new journals that need prestige. There are a couple ways to break that circle, but nevertheless, it's a problem that keeps new open access journals from becoming known as excellent, even if they are excellent from birth. That is, if prestige is our way of talking about reputed excellence, then an open access journal can be excellent from birth, but not reputed to be excellent because it doesn't have this prestige. One way to solve it is for prestigious existing scholars to submit some of their best work to new open access journals. This is more likely to happen with those who already have tenure. And that's one reason why those who already have tenure should consider doing that. Another way is to recruit eminent editors to serve on the editorial board. That's been done at the PLOS Biology. It's been done at the BMC Journal of Biology. Both the Public Library of Science and Biomed Central, the two major open access publishers, have Nobel laureates on their boards. And many Nobel laureates actually support open access. And one way they can lend their prestige to these efforts is by serving on the editorial boards. Another way to break the vicious circle is to convert existing journals that already have prestige. And that's when we get to the second problem. It would work if it would work, but it's hard to persuade journals, existing toll access publishing houses, to convert their journals. There are a large number of experiments, subscription-based journals offering more and more of their content, and maybe different kinds of their content at different times in open access. Maybe open access to the current issue but not to past issues, or maybe open access to past issues but not the current issue, or maybe open access to some categories of articles but not all articles, or maybe open access after a certain embargo period, or maybe open access article by article at the author's choice. So if these journals support themselves with a payment from the author or the author's sponsor, then they could have a standing offer. We charge a subscription, but any author who can come up with a fee that covers all of our expenses in reviewing your article will get open access to the result. And there are a couple hybrid journals that now offer that. So experiments are one thing. They're positive, they generate data that help persuade other journals, but a full-blown conversion of a subscription-based journal to open access is still pretty rare, and you can imagine why. Another barrier is simply widespread misunderstanding about at least two things. One is this problem of the alleged corruption of peer review by open access journals. As you've seen, I think we can actually turn the tables on that against the subscription-based journals. There's also widespread misunderstanding about the business model. It's true that many open access journals, and some of the most prominent ones, pay their bills by asking the author or the author's sponsor to pay an upfront processing fee. But there are two problems with that. One is that it's usually misnamed the author payment model, so that everybody gets the idea that this fee comes out of the author's pocket. And the other problem is that it's not the only business model for an open access journal. There are many others, and in some disciplines, in some countries, in some time periods, the upfront funding model will simply not work. It has been working very successfully in biomedicine, but one reason is that biomedicine is a well-funded discipline where most research is backed by research grants, and those grants will pay these fees. In other disciplines, like my own, which is philosophy, essentially no research is funded, and it will come out of the author's pocket if anywhere. And most authors look at that fee and say, I can't pay that. And then authors in poorer countries say that even more readily. It's a lot like the college admissions problem. If you look at the retail price of a college and you don't know about financial aid, you say, that's out of the question for me. If you think this is an author pays model and you look at the retail price of these fees, the cost of peer review, the cost of markup, the cost of editing, and you say, I'm out of the ballpark, what open access has really done then, you think, is to make access easy for readers but suddenly difficult for authors. And instead of putting the burden on readers where it has been, there's now a new burden on authors, a kind of censorship. That's a misunderstanding. Every open access journal publisher waives the fees in cases of economic hardship. Every single one. Some of them do it systematically so that all authors from developing countries, and there's a precise way to define which ones those are, have an automatic waiver. There are institutional memberships so that when the institution pays a fee, which is like a prepaid discount on this, then every author from that institution who publishes in that journal has a waiver. There are other ways to do it, but above all, there are other models that don't charge any fees at all. Philosopher's Imprint, which I'm picking on purpose as an example because it's in my discipline, which is not well funded, has for its motto, edited by philosophers, published by librarians. And the philosophers are in the philosophy department at the University of Michigan. The librarians are in the library at the University of Michigan. They're all on the payroll already of the University of Michigan. So they don't need to collect fees from either side. So they don't charge subscriptions, it's open access. They don't charge fees to authors. What they did have to do was persuade the university that this is a good use of librarian time. But they did persuade the university of that. And by the way, the same argument has been used for years that this is a good use of faculty time. And many universities host journals, knowing that faculty and secretaries will be giving some of their time to journals. Now librarians are being allowed, at least at some universities, to do that. When that happens, there are no fees charged on either side. One thing we have to get out is that that's another business model. There isn't just one. It's not all about upfront funding. The progress with funders is that they are willing to pay the processing fees charged by open access journals when they exist. But there's still a long way to go. The most important thing they could do, they're not yet doing. They're not making open access a condition of funding in the first place. They should, because it's in their interest to do so, simply as an investment. They are the ones putting up their money because they think this project is worthy. If it's really worthy, and if they want the maximum bang for their buck, they should say the result of that research must be made openly accessible. And there are different ways to do that. If you don't want to hurt your author's career, then you don't want to say you must publish in an open access journal. Only 5% of existing journals are open access, and there may not be a good one in your discipline, and the ones in your discipline may not have high prestige. So if you force authors into those journals, you might be hurting their careers. You don't have to do that. You can just say open access by one method or another, so that if you publish in a traditional toll access, subscription-based, maybe high prestige journal, you still deposit a copy of the same article in an open access archive. If all funding agencies said that, open access one way or another, then suddenly most research in the world, in every discipline, at least in the sciences, would be open access. It's not just that authors would have a choice to be reimbursed on their fees if they chose open access. It would all become open access. And then perversely, the same agencies that are willing to pay these fees and who believe in open access as an abstract principle tend to give their grants only to authors who have proved their worth by publishing in a small set of high prestige journals, steering those authors away from open access journals, again, not because they're open, but because they're new and they don't yet have the prestige of the old ones. So they've got to get their act together, and if they're really believing in open access, they've got to accept that some applicants for grants can be worthy of a grant even though they've only published in open access journals. Private funders should see it's in their interest to provide open access to all the results of their research. Public funders have a separate reason to think about this, and that is all the money they give out is from taxpayers, and taxpayers should have free access to the results of taxpayer-funded research. If it's public money, there should be public access to that research. When I talk to public funders, the staffers at these agencies all agree with that principle. I've never met one who didn't. But they, no matter how higher up they are in the agency, they don't have control over the policy, which is to let the author take a copyright in their article, and then, because of the usual customs of the marketplace, transfer that copyright to a journal who will then use it to refuse consent to open access. And so even though the taxpayer paid for it, it ends up being locked away in a journal with a price that's moving out of sight, and more libraries can't even subscribe to it. So that the researchers who need it don't have access, and the taxpayers who paid for it don't have access. So while the funders are helping out, there's a lot they could do and should do without violating their own interests. Universities have been starting to launch open access repositories. That's good. Since the fall of 2003, let's say since the October of 2003, I've counted 14 instances in which large universities or consortia have canceled Science Direct, or canceled a 3-year renewal in favor of a 1-year renewal, or canceled journals within the Elsevier package by the hundreds in order to save money. And of the 14, most, let's say 13, had public statements explaining why. The Triangle Research Library Network was one of these. That's good. That it's not just that these decisions are being made, but the public statements are giving courage to other universities that don't have the courage. You know that it takes courage to do this, especially when you're receiving demands all the time from faculty. If cancellation is unthinkable, then Elsevier has won and open access has lost. Cancellation has to at least be thinkable. What's encouraging about these libraries is that librarians have persuaded faculty that this is in their interest, and faculty have endorsed them and put off their short-term interest in access next year for their long-term interest in better publishing models for the long run. That's the good news. The bad news is that universities could be doing more, and not only are they not doing it, they're slow, maybe they're digging in their heels a bit. You need policies to fill these archives, these repositories. One policy that would work is to say to faculty members, if you want your research articles to be reviewed by our promotion and tenure committee, they have to be open access. And again, just like the foundations, we don't want to hurt your career by forcing you to publish in the only open access journal in your field, which might be low prestige. You can publish anywhere you can be accepted, but take a copy and deposit it in the institutional repository. Most journals will already allow that, and some who don't will allow it on request. By the way, one of the experiences at the University of Glasgow was that even when the journal had a published policy against this, they would often say yes if they were asked about a single article. Or if their published policies were silent on the question, they would say yes if they were asked about an individual article. If you asked them to announce a general policy, they would say no, we're not ready to do that. But they'll say yes about individual requests very often. So putting this requirement on faculty who are coming up for tenure or promotion would work more than 80% of the time. I think we have good evidence of that. Moreover, a study that was just done by JISC and OSI showed that an overwhelming majority of faculty would be willing to work under those conditions. That is, they would not think of that as coercion or as an underhanded tactic by their school. When foundations cannot pay the processing fees charged by open access journals, universities are the next best institution to do that. But they've been slow to do that. What they have to recognize is that in the long run, if open access succeeds and takes off, there will be enormous savings through the cancellation of expensive subscription-based journals. And the best use of that money would be to pay for the superior publishing alternative. And if we can control author behavior and refund journals in this new way by encouraging authors to publish in open access, we have to do that through the promotion and tenure committees and the criteria that they use. If they say we're only going to promote you if you publish in this small set of high prestige journals, which tend not to be open access because open access journals are too new to have that prestige, then they make the problem worse. They're not helping, they're hurting. I don't want to tell them to stop doing that. The problem is not that they should stop trying to sort out the better from the worst among the articles written by their faculty, but they should do it better. They're doing it with such a crude tool now that they end up classifying a lot of first-rate work as if it were second-rate because it was not published in a journal which is known to be first-rate. They end up discriminating against all new journals when what they really mean to do is to discriminate only against the second rate. And finally, everything depends on author behavior. I should have put this first, but I put it last. Authors decide whether to submit their work to open access journals. Authors decide whether to deposit their work in open access repositories. And authors decide whether to transfer copyright to a journal that might eventually use that to refuse consent to open access. So everything depends on what authors do. And when I talked about funding agencies, governments, and universities, the reason is that these are the institutions in the greatest position to influence the behavior of authors. When authors understand open access, they support it. Again, in overwhelming numbers, they say, even if I was required by my funding agency or by my promotion and tenure committee to provide open access to my work, I wouldn't regard that as coercion. I can see that that's in my interest. But that's only when they understand it. And in my view, most of them don't understand it. Most of them are not paying attention. It's the same old problem. They're preoccupied by their research. They don't think the technology and economics of scholarly publishing are of interest to them. They don't see how it is of interest to them. That's the problem. They have a strong interest in it, but they don't know that they have a strong interest in it. So what we really need to do is educate authors about the interest, about the connection between providing open access and providing impact to their work, which results in career building and career advancement. And then we have to provide incentives to them to provide that open access. And the best incentives come from the funding agencies and from the universities. That's it. Thanks.
My name's Melissa Hagen. I'm with OSI's Open Access Project. As we had mentioned earlier, we were going to try to connect Mark McCabe. Unfortunately, his plane wasn't able to land last night because of the problems at the airport. But his presentation was somewhat technical on the economics of open access. We thought it might be better to begin to open it up for discussion. And specifically, as we are meeting with a group of librarians, we really wanted to emphasize the role that librarians can play if they are interested in the open access movement. And I think actually the slide which Peter had up previously about what universities can do to support open access, I think that applies quite well to the role that librarians can play in this movement. And also I wanted to point out that OSI and SPARC have supported a project which Peter referred to earlier called the Directory of Open Access Journals, and this is funded through the Lund University Libraries in Sweden, and they've developed a directory of over 1,900 journal titles which are freely available online. So that's a very useful resource for librarians and researchers. Peter pointed out as well, one of the main roles that the librarians can take is to try to work to help start the institutional repositories within the university systems. And OSI helped to develop a guide for institutional repository software, which lists the 7 open source OAI compliant software systems. So that is a tool which hopefully could be of use to librarians as well. So if there are any questions, we can start opening them up for Peter or for Jean-Claude or any of our other guests.
I'm just curious what the speakers think. It seems like in the long term, decoupling dissemination and certification is really the long-term answer. I mean, open access journals are a good way to get it started and show faculty that this can be successful, but I think essentially, like on the model of the physics and some of the computer science people, that seems to be a better way to go. And then the societies who are so scared of this could maybe play a role in that certification process. So, because a lot of faculty are already posting them on their own websites, they're disseminating, they're emailing them to each other, they're using preprint servers, so they're already disseminating outside of journals, and they're using the journals to certify grants, tenure, etc. And it seems like if we could convince some of the societies, because that's sort of the linchpin of the whole thing, right? Which we all know, but there seems to be a role there. And I'm just curious what you think. And then also, a lot of faculty are doing it already. So some of them I talk to, they don't see the benefit of an institutional repository because it's on my website and people are finding it, that kind of stuff. So I was just curious. That's 2 questions, I guess.
Yeah. On the second point first, I just wrote an article for my newsletter last month about that argument. If I put it on my website, isn't that good enough? And about 2 years ago, the answer was no, certainly not. Now, especially in light of those Google and Yahoo initiatives, the answer is yeah, it might well be good enough. It's getting very close anyway. Because as soon as your article is indexed by Google and Yahoo, it's going to be visible to most people who will be looking, even if it's not visible to all the people who would look in repositories. It's still the case that putting it in both the repository and someplace on the surface web where Google can find it will be best. But now what's happening is that putting it in a repository is equivalent to doing both, because Google is crawling the repositories. When you only put it on your website, you're only visible to those mainstream tools. And you all know as well as anybody that students prefer these mainstream tools to the ones that you pay so much money for. Scholars are still mixed, and they use some of the dedicated scholarly search tools, but they also tend to use Google. 2 years ago, Google was the second most used search tool in the field of chemistry by professional chemists. And that's when ChemWeb still existed. ChemWeb was just spun off by Elsevier, so it may be the first right now. Again, that may be regrettable, but it's true that scholars tend to go to Google and Yahoo before they go to some dedicated tools. But you can get the best of both worlds by depositing in a repository. And if your repository isn't yet crawled by Google, you can count on it being crawled by Google shortly, because Google is investing in that. It's seeking this content out. But you can also ensure it by putting one copy in the repository, one copy on your personal website. Now, to get, yeah.
Well, can you post articles on your personal website if signed away your copyright?
Yes, most of the time. If you've signed away the copyright, then you need the permission of the copyright holder. But almost every journal is willing to let you post a copy on your personal website. Some of them distinguish between putting it on your personal website and putting it in an institutional repository, but it's because they don't understand the difference. They say you can put it on your own website when own means one provided by your institution. You don't have to own the server. And some portion of the institutional server which is dedicated to you and your work, well, that's really what it means to be inside an institutional repository. The portion of it where yours resides is devoted to your work. So it meets their definition of own. Now, maybe if they sharpen their definition, they could make a distinction here. And the way this was sometimes put by publishers is that we don't mind open access if it's unsystematic, but as soon as it gets systematic and easy to find, then we object. But the fact is, putting it on your solo website is suddenly systematic. If Google is indexing it, it's going to be easy to find, and there's no longer a useful distinction between a personal website and an institutional repository from that standpoint, from the standpoint of visibility. And it doesn't mean that journals understand this, and they still sometimes draw this distinction. But even when they draw the distinction, they let you put it on your personal website. They see that as unreasonable not to consent to that. So the answer is yes. You still need permission, however, if you have transferred copyright. One thing I would encourage all authors to do is either retain copyright and only give what the journal needs, which is the exclusive right of first print and electronic publication, or transfer the package of rights and ask for the other rights back again. And again, a growing number of journals are either willing to say yes or at least to negotiate. Yeah, the Romeo project, which was originally at Notting, Loughborough, has moved to Sherpa. It's a database of publisher policies on copyright and archiving. And it's organized right now by publisher, not by journal. But when independent scholars have done the same table, breaking it down by journal, they get even better results. That is, more journals are willing to consent to this than publishers are. Or the publishers that are willing to consent publish more journals than the ones that are not.
I'd like to react to your first question, which was the decoupling question, which I think is very important indeed. You're right. I mean, in doing open access, you're doing the decoupling in many ways. You could do the decoupling without doing open access, of course. And that's another, the converse is not true. But what I think also it opens the door to is the possibility not only of creating so-called overlay journals over open access archives, which would be another way to express decoupling, but you could also and even invent gradual promotions to have ever higher levels of you might say, branding through that decoupling. In other words, you could have the evaluation done locally, regionally, nationally, internationally, and every time bring it up to a higher level, a bit on the model of what we already do with scientific prizes, actually. Right. So you could build a sort of growing visibility through different forms of branding, which would in effect make the whole notion of journal and the branding through journals far more flexible and far richer than what we have right now.
Yeah, and that seems attractive to scholars. I think in
Of
the long
course.
run we could, because I think there's a misnomer about peer review that it doesn't say this is great. It says this is good enough and it's interesting.
Yes.
But
And
there is
that's
a-
it. And so, like you said, it could be more sophisticated if we took more time. We disseminated it, that would be fast enough.
Yep.
You know, journals are short on both ends. They're not out fast enough, and they don't do enough to
Yep.
certify. So it seems logical.
Yep.
There's
It's
another
hard. I
level-
know it's practical matters. It's hard.
There's
But
another
that seems
level
like a
of
long
decoupling
way to
we need
go.
for this, and I support that second level, and that is we should decouple peer review from journals. We can decouple journals from access, which we're already doing through preprint archives, but we can decouple peer review from journals. In my view, the most important function served by a journal is to provide peer review. And peer review can be provided by the editorial board and by referees. They don't have to disseminate anything. So if we had freestanding editorial boards who simply provided an imprimatur based on their authority, their credibility within the field, then we could have plural endorsements. This is what Jean-Claude's talking about. And moreover, we could have what I'm calling retroactive peer review. First you put your work online in a repository, and then you ask these various editorial boards in your field to take a look at it. And if they put their stamp on it, you would get more than one stamp over time. And one editorial board might represent one methodological standpoint within a discipline with many, and another might represent another one. If you've got the stamps that matter to you, you've got all that you really care about. You've got all that you would have gotten from publishing in a high prestige journal, because you've got the high prestige stamp.
And
And what we
but
really
even
need is,
more in
let's call
theory.
it a free market of stamps. We need a free market of these endorsements that don't have to be connected to dissemination at all. That's really a print era coupling that we can lose in the era of the internet.
One interesting and amusing thing about peer review, a Spanish sociologist did the following research. He contacted 76 Nobel Prize winners, and asked them, have you ever had an article that was really important for the prize you won that was rejected by a journal? All of them did. Which shows that peer review is not really quality control, but what I call scientific passport process. You know, you get into scientific territory through peer review, but you don't guarantee quality yet, and yet it is bandied about as such.
But it's still accepted, you know, it's still what they accept. So I think it has to go hand in hand with promotion and tenure, and how the universities evolve to do that. Because I'm sitting here as a librarian thinking, how do we get this multi-tiered system to develop? I mean, who's going to take that step out first, and how do we help? And so, you know, I don't know if you all are addressing that, but maybe you could talk about that a little
Well,
bit.
Jean-Claude mentioned overlay journals, and that's one step in the right direction. An overlay journal starts with an open access archive. An archive by itself does not perform peer review. It simply takes articles on deposit and makes them openly accessible. If you had an editorial board, free-floating editorial board with no journal, it could take submissions to this archive as if they were submissions to a journal, review them in the standard way or in some innovative way, it doesn't even matter, and the ones that they accept or endorse, they could redeposit in the archive, either with a declaration that it's been approved or with new metadata showing that it's been approved, or maybe deposit in a separate archive. But there's a way to tell that these are the approved footage. And that's it, that's a journal. You've got submission, you've got vetting, you've got approval, and you've got publicity for the stamp of approval when it comes. And there are, by the way, overlay journals right now. The University of California just launched a series of overlay journals in multiple disciplines. Once you have that, you start to accustom people to the idea that editorial boards don't have to be parts of journals. And once you've got that, you can encourage people, let's say the 12 people in the world who know most about X, which is a microscopically small topic, to get together and become an editorial board on X, and to take their submissions from anywhere.
I could see consortium of universities defining overlay evaluation, let's say, that would be valid for their tenure and promotion system. In other words, say the Big Ten in the United States, deciding that they're going to create some sort of international evaluation board for a variety of disciplines, looking at a variety of repositories, and inside these 10 universities, all tenure and promotion committee have to take for granted that that evaluation is valid. At that point, the problem is well worn, it seems to me. And it's not very difficult to imagine organizing that and doing that.
having gone this far down the road, let me just add a qualification. I don't want to mix up peer review with open access. I think open access can make possible many exciting new forms of peer review, and some of them are likely to be superior to what we have today. But I think they're separate issues, and it would be bad for open access if the issues were linked, because then people would say, I can't approve of open access until I agree with you about the best way to do peer review. Open access is compatible with every kind of peer review. It's compatible with strong and rigorous peer review, with weak and sloppy peer review. It's compatible with prospective and retroactive peer review. Let's get open access first and let people experiment with it and do it in every which way, but not link the issues together.
You know, the idea of having an editorial board instead of having that board linked with a journal is good in other ways too. As you mentioned, you know, sometimes journals get published, type articles get published because there are not enough articles there
Yes.
at that particular time, or others don't get published because there happens to be
Too many.
a confluence of things being written on a certain topic, and these are all reasons that make you think that a more merit-based or work-based system of
Yeah,
evaluation
the journal
would
or a
really
board that
welcome.
can give as many or as few stamps of approval
Yeah,
as we're
right.
working. And there was no pressure on it to do 120 a year.
I know this is not an original notion at all, but in the context of this decoupling of peer review from an open archive, open access institutional repository, and the lack of interest in faculty in contributing to an archive that's already there, I wonder if it wouldn't make a lot more sense for institutional repositories to be discipline-based rather than institutional-based archives. I mean, it would feed all those different components.
Well, there are some that are disciplinary based. For example, Archive with the X, or Chi, is the disciplinary based one, and it's the most successful by far of all the archives in the world. The problem, there's no problem. First of all, we should have both. And when disciplinary archives can work, they ought to be launched and they ought to be made to work. However, disciplines aren't organized institutionally and can't nudge participants to use them. What you have in the case of archive is a culture in which faculty already feel obliged to use them. In fact, if they don't deposit their preprint in archive, they're invisible. That's what you'd really like to see in every discipline. But how do you get there from here in some discipline that isn't already like that? You need a nudge. You need institutions that can adopt policies that will actually push authors in this direction. Universities are in a better position to do that than disciplines. So we need the institutional archives, at least during this period in which there's a lot of nudging to do. But institutional archives can be organized internally by disciplines. And they can be organized internally in overlapping categories, including discipline, including rank or seniority, anything else that you might want to do. And you might be able to use that as a way of developing a disciplinary culture.
I know there's a lot of concern about open access and preservation.
Yeah.
That might speak to the institution being the host versus a traveling editorial. But would you speak to preservation?
Yeah.
I've had that concern expressed to me by faculty.
Yeah. First, it's just as important to preserve open access literature for the long term as it is print literature, obviously. And the easy way to do it is to provide printouts. And open access is compatible with printing out. All of the major open access journal publishers also make print editions, which they sell at cost to anybody who wants them. For example, if libraries want them for their own long-term curation, then they're allowed to buy them. And they're careful to price these so that they neither make nor lose money on them. Their primary enterprise is the open access journal. Another way to preserve the Biomed Central, which is the largest open access journal publisher, has made a deal with the Royal Library of Holland. The Royal Library of Holland does preserve the entire corpus of Biomed Central literature. Another way that Biomed Central does this is to allow anybody in the world to download a zipped file of the entire corpus. And the original purpose for this was to encourage experiments in text mining. If you've got your own text mining ideas and you want a huge corpus to work on, take our free body of literature in this zip file. But one side effect has been that an unknown number of thousands of people have done this. And now there are copies, duplicates all over the world. And there's really no danger at all that that entire body will disappear at any time. Then there's an initiative called LOCKSS, L-O-C-K-S-S. It stands for Lots of Copies Keep Stuff Safe. And it's really the same principle made systematic. It's a peer-to-peer network of archives that update each other, that keep each other in synchrony, so that if one of them goes corrupt. For example, this actually happened during their beta period. One lab went on fire and it destroyed the machine. As soon as it was rebuilt, it was automatically updated by the peer machines that detected the corruption. And so not only do you have multiple copies, but you have multiple copies that are kept in secret by pretty easy P2P software. And there are journals now making deals with locks to guarantee the long-term preservation of their work.
And in passing, if you write open access journals, it's a lot easier to make locks work than if you have to do the digital rights management process on top of it. So that you might even come to a conclusion that over the medium to long term, only open access documents will be preserved relatively easily in the digital world, so that our descendants may never know about the locked up information that you're producing.
As you probably know, as librarians, when you have traditional literature, you don't have permission to preserve it long term if it's electronic, because either you have to make periodic payments, or you're only leasing it and you don't own it, and you don't have permission to migrate it to new formats or new media as technology moves on. And either you'd have to pay again, or you would have to get special permission. Open access comes with that permission. So in that sense, it makes preservation even easier than it is with traditional literature.
I can see that we needed another few hours to keep this discussion going. I want to thank our speakers. I want to thank Anthony So, whom I didn't acknowledge at the very beginning. He's come out here and he's had a very big role in making this possible. And I hope you'll continue to discuss this among yourselves and get in touch with our speakers as needed and watch for them in other venues. Thank you very much.